So today we're doing a deep dive into something you brought to the table, this 2024 paper called Misogyny and Organization Studies.
Yeah.
And this one feels, I think, especially relevant in today's world.
I agree.
It really gets into how misogyny operates, not just in the world at large, but within workplaces and even within kind of the bubble of organization studies itself.
Yeah.
So
A good one?
it is a good one. So, we hear about sexism, right? We hear about these things, but this paper suggests that it's often kind of baked into the systems and cultures that we're navigating every day. And that's kind of, I think, where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
So before we even get into some of the examples, because I know you have some really good ones, let's just kind of define misogyny, because it's one of those words that gets tossed around a lot, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Well, McCarthy and Taylor, the authors, right?
Yeah.
They really want us to push to see it as more than just an individual prejudice against women.
Okay.
They're defining it as a system of power.
Interesting.
It's a force that enforces very traditional gender roles and then also punishes anyone who steps outside of those lines.
Oh, wow.
And this system, they argue, is very much active in numerous organizations, and it could be conscious or unconscious.
Right. So it's not just about a few bad apples. It's a system that often rewards certain behaviors and punishes others based on gender.
Exactly.
One of the examples, and I think we should definitely dig into this one a little bit more, is the example of Maria Ressa, the journalist.
Yes.
And this feels like a really stark example of what the authors call organized misogyny.
Absolutely. And Ressa's case is really tragic because it clearly illustrates this concept.
Yeah.
She faces relentless online harassment. A lot of it is sexualized, it's violent, and it's simply for doing her job as a journalist, which is really the scary part, right? And so what makes it organized misogyny is the coordinated effort behind these attacks.
Right.
So it's not just random individuals. This is often groups with an agenda to silence and discredit women who are challenging power structures.
Yeah, it's almost like weaponizing
It is.
weaponizing misogyny in a way.
Right, it is.
And it's chilling. It's really chilling to think about. And it's not just limited to these high-profile cases like Ressa's, right?
Right.
The paper also brings up the example of institutional sexism within the London Metropolitan Police.
Oh, yeah.
Which, I mean...
Deeply ingrained.
Deeply ingrained. And this feels like a prime example of what they're calling organizational misogyny, right?
Exactly. And so it's not about a few bad officers.
Right.
It's about the entire culture where certain behaviors are normalized and even expected.
Right.
So think about the Sarah Everard case, right?
Right.
The murders of those two sisters. And then countless stories of harassment within the force.
Yeah.
This is it's heartbreaking, but it's an illustration of how organizational misogyny allows harmful behavior to flourish.
Right.
And it makes it incredibly difficult to challenge.
It's almost insidious, the way that it becomes ingrained in the culture, and people start accepting it as just how things are.
Yes, 100%.
The example also of exploitation in garment factories, right?
Yes.
This one really struck me too, because it shows how misogyny doesn't operate in a vacuum, right?
Right.
It often operates alongside other forms of oppression.
Absolutely. So it's not just about sexism, but how these systemic inequalities based on gender, race, economic status, all of these things intersect, and they create especially vulnerable situations for certain groups of women.
Right.
And we saw that even more so with COVID, right? We saw all these canceled orders, which led to mass firings, women then forced into taking even riskier jobs just to survive, and then a lot of them facing threats for speaking out about unsafe conditions.
It's all...
And it really highlights how misogyny often goes hand in hand with things like racial capitalism.
Yeah.
They're all very, very interlinked.
It feels like we're already seeing how these concepts, even just in these couple of examples, are playing out in different but equally harmful ways.
Absolutely.
To be clear, before we move on, because I think this is an important distinction, what is the key difference between organized misogyny and organizational misogyny?
Okay, so think of organized misogyny as having a clear, coordinated agenda.
Okay.
Right? So your online hate groups
Right.
that are targeting women in the public eye, or even certain professional spheres where those attitudes are pervasive.
Got it.
Organizational misogyny is often much subtler, but no less insidious.
Right.
This is like your workplace culture
Yeah.
that tolerates those belittling comments, overlooks women for promotions, turns a blind eye to harassment, or dismisses it with a "that's just how he is" attitude.
Which, of course, allows it to continue.
Exactly.
Because it's not being addressed head on.
It's not, and then it just becomes part of the fabric of the organization.
Precisely.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that McCarthy and Taylor aren't content with simply defining these forms of misogyny.
Yeah.
They challenge us to think about how we can actively create work environments that are hostile to it.
I love that because it feels like they're pushing us towards solutions.
Yeah.
Which I always,
Always important.
always important. But before we jump into that, I kind of want to bring it back to the person who's listening right now. Whether you're, a man or a woman, whether you work in a traditional office or not, why should we care about understanding these different, flavors of misogyny?
Right.
How does it impact us on an individual level?
That's the crucial question, isn't it?
Right.
Because recognizing misogyny in all its forms is really the first step towards dismantling it.
Okay.
And if we can start to identify those subtle forms of bias, those seemingly small but harmful norms, that's when we can start to create truly inclusive workplaces.
Right.
Where everyone can thrive, and that benefits everyone.
Right, and that's a good point. It's not just
women.
Not just women. It's about creating environments that are hostile to misogyny, not just trying to be, neutral or ignore it.
Exactly.
It suggests a more, proactive approach, it seems like.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that silence is not neutrality. It can often be complicity. So we need to be willing to see these systems. We need to call these behaviors out for what they are, and then we have to get to work to dismantle them.
That's powerful. This idea of misogyny as a system, I think, is something that really resonated with me in reading this.
It's a big shift in thinking for a lot of people.
It is. And, I think if we're going to dismantle it, we need to understand how it operates on that deeper level.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because it challenges us to look beyond those individual acts of sexism and really consider these broader cultural and societal forces at play.
Let's dig into that. What are some of the less obvious ways that this system of misogyny shows up in the workplace? We've touched on a few examples, but I'm curious, what else can we look for? What should people be paying attention to? So we're talking about misogyny as a system.
Yeah.
These invisible forces that can shape how we act, what we come to expect.
Right.
Often without even realizing it.
And that's precisely why it's so important to bring these dynamics to the surface, right?
Okay.
And so McCarthy and Taylor, they draw on the work of philosopher Kate Mann, who describes misogyny as, quote, law enforcement for patriarchy.
Whoa, law enforcement for patriarchy.
Yeah.
That's a powerful way to put it.
It is. It's a really powerful way to think about it.
Yeah.
Because it highlights how misogyny, it kind of kicks in,
Yeah.
right, to put women back in their place whenever they challenge that established order.
Right.
Right. Think about it. When a woman is assertive in the workplace, she's often labeled as bossy or aggressive.
Oh, for sure.
But a man exhibiting that same behavior might be praised as a strong leader.
100%.
Right. So it's that subtle enforcement mechanism that maintains the status quo.
Yeah, it's like this invisible hand pushing back whenever women try to reach for those leadership roles or challenge those expectations. And that constant pushback, it's got to take a toll, right?
It absolutely does. And that actually leads into one of the most crucial takeaways from this paper for me, is they argue that we need to shift our focus away from trying to understand the individual motivations of men who act in misogynistic ways.
Oh, interesting.
And instead focus on the impact of misogyny on women.
That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah.
Because it's not about letting those individuals off the hook. It's about trying to understand those systemic forces at play and how they affect women's experiences.
Exactly. Because if we just focus on those individual attitudes or those actions, it kind of distracts us from seeing and challenging the larger system.
Right. Exactly.
Actually doing the work.
Okay, so how does that reveal itself in, everyday work life? I mean, we talk about some of the more blatant forms, but what are some of the more subtle ways that this system operates? What should people kind of be paying attention to?
So I think about those small, seemingly insignificant interactions that a lot of women experience regularly in the workplace.
Okay.
Right? It could be as simple as a woman's ideas being consistently overlooked or dismissed in meetings, only to then be picked up and praised when a man repeats them. Or being passed over for promotions with very vague justifications about fit or experience
Right.
that seem to mask a deeper bias.
Right. It's those subtle digs
Yeah.
that I think can really chip away at a woman's confidence over time.
Precisely. And it's not always about overt hostility.
Right.
Sometimes it's about being consistently underestimated, talked over, or having your contributions minimized. And these seemingly minor incidents, when you look at them collectively, they create a culture where women are constantly having to fight to be heard, to be respected.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the emotional labor that's involved in navigating those minefields every single day.
Oh, absolutely.
The constant pressure to, downplay your achievements so you don't come across as too ambitious, or to laugh off those backhanded compliments that are really just thinly veiled attempts to put you back in your place. It's exhausting.
It is incredibly draining. And that exhaustion, that's a feature of the system, not a bug. It's about wearing women down, making it harder for them to keep pushing for change, keep speaking up.
Which is why it's so important to name these experiences, right?
Yes.
To shine a light on the system that allows them to continue. And I think that's something that this paper does really well.
It does.
It doesn't just leave us with this sense of despair.
Right.
It offers this way forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they argue that we need research that goes beyond simply documenting these instances of misogyny.
Okay.
Right? Like, we need to move beyond just talking about it.
Right.
They want to see studies that explore how organizations can become actively hostile to misogyny,
I love that.
that foster cultures where women can actually thrive.
Yes.
It's about moving from awareness into action.
Yes, and that's what I really appreciate, I think, about this paper, is that it's not just, identifying the problem. It's like, how do we actually start to seek out solutions?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about those solutions.
Right.
What can individuals, what can organizations do to create those, hostile environments to misogyny?
Yes.
How do we actually start to dismantle this system? So we're talking about solutions here, about creating organizations that aren't just not misogynistic,
right,
but actively hostile to misogyny.
Yes.
And that feels, that feels different.
It is.
Than the diversity and inclusion efforts that we often hear about,
It is. And McCarthy and Taylor actually suggest that those traditional efforts, while, often very well intentioned, they can sometimes feel like checking boxes.
Right.
They're often focused on metrics and representation, which are important, but they don't necessarily address the underlying cultural dynamics.
Okay, so what are they proposing instead? Because they use this phrase affective atmospheres that, I'll be honest, I wasn't totally clear on.
Yeah.
So how does that play into creating these environments that are pushing back against misogyny?
So that's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how change actually happens, right?
Okay.
So when we talk about affective atmospheres, we're talking about the feeling, the vibe of a workplace.
Yeah.
It's about asking, how do women feel in this environment?
Interesting.
Do they feel safe to speak up?
Yeah.
Do they feel valued for their contributions? Are they respected for their expertise?
So it's less about having a policy, it sounds like,
Right.
and more about how that policy actually translates into the lived experience of being, a woman in that space.
Exactly. It's about shifting from simply preventing that overt discrimination to cultivating a culture where that subtle, often unconscious bias is consistently challenged.
Which I imagine is a lot harder to do.
It is much harder.
Because you're dealing with ingrained behaviors, assumptions that people may not even be aware of.
Right, exactly.
So how do we even begin to identify and address those?
And that's where things get really interesting, because McCarthy and Taylor suggest that we need to get creative.
Okay.
They propose looking to some really innovative research methods.
Okay.
And I love that they talk about incorporating things like drawing, storytelling, even using fictional narratives
Interesting.
as tools for uncovering and understanding those hidden dynamics of organizational misogyny.
It's like we're trying to find new ways to see this problem.
Yes.
That's often hiding in plain sight.
Exactly.
Right. Because it's not always about what's explicitly said.
Right.
It's about the unspoken rules, the expectations that shape how we interact with each other.
You've hit the nail on the head.
And we can't forget about, this idea of intersectionality too.
Right. Absolutely crucial.
Because misogyny impacts different women in different ways.
It does.
Right. It's not a monolithic experience.
Right. And they actually use the example of global supply chains where women of color are often relegated to those lowest paid, most precarious jobs, subject to multiple forms of oppression at the same time.
Right. So it's not just about...
It's everything.
It's about understanding how these systems are all interconnected, right?
Yes.
And how they sort of prop each other up in a way.
Exactly.
So where do we begin? I mean, if we're talking about dismantling systems, it feels so massive.
Right.
What can people listening, in their own workplaces, what can they do to start chipping away at this?
I think it's a journey, not a destination.
Okay.
It begins with these conversations. It begins with being willing to name these issues, even when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It starts with listening to women's experiences, believing them, and then working together to create real, lasting change.
I love that. And on that note, I want to kind of turn that back to you listening.
Okay.
Because McCarthy and Taylor urge us to create these work environments that are actively hostile to misogyny.
Yeah.
So I'll ask, what concrete actions can you take in your own sphere of influence to challenge these systems and create a more just and equitable working world for everyone?
Well,
food for thought.